مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. تواصل حركة طالبان إحكام قبضتها على السلطة في أفغانستان بعد عام من سيطرتها على العاصمة كابول، وما رافق ذلك من إجلاء فوضوي للقوات الأمريكية تبعته أزمة إنسانية واقتصادية وهجمات جهادية. نعود اليوم مع ضيفنا إلى أبرز الأحداث التي شهدتها أفغانستان خلال سنة من حكم طالبان لنتوقف عند الملامح اليومية لحياة الناس هناك. ينضم إلينا من إسلام آباد عبيد الله بهير المحاضر بالجامعة الأمريكية في أفغانستان. أستاذ عبيد الله مرحبا بك معنا.
هلا والله, thank you for having me.
طالبان وعام بعد استيلائها على السلطة، ما الذي تغير في البلاد؟
I think everything and nothing. For some people, their whole lives have changed. Everything that they knew, everything they dreamed of is gone because the Taliban that they were told they should fear for 20 years are now in power, and the Taliban are trying to build their own world in their own image. And for some people, nothing has changed. Most of Afghanistan's rural population always lived in destitute situations economically, and they were very religious and cultural to begin with. So for them, the Taliban coming to power is just a regime change. Some of them are happy with it because that means that there is security, there is lesser killing, there's lesser active conflict. So I guess the question of what has changed is different depending on who you ask.
ما ملامح الحياة اليومية بعد عودة طالبان؟ كيف يعيش الناس العاديون؟
But there are no normal people in Afghanistan, but yeah, the day-to-day lives, especially within the urban centers and within the cities, I mean, our economy has crashed. It's in free fall. It has been for a year. We're facing the worst humanitarian crisis in modern history. That means every 3 out of 4 Afghans don't know where their next meal is going to come from. The shops are emptier. There are lesser jobs to go around. So it feels like life is very colorless. But despite that, Afghans have been in conflict. They have been fighting the odds that are stacked against them for 40 years now. So Afghans still manage to live their lives. If you go out into the bazaars, you will still see the women, you will still see men going out, trying to make something out of life. So despite its struggles, the Afghan nation and the Afghan people go on and they persist.
أعذرني، قلت ليس هناك من أناس عاديين في أفغانستان، كيف؟
I mean, there is no standard Afghan, you know, I think, and that's fair for everyone, for every nation. You can't just say, how are the Emiratis doing? Because the Emiratis aren't one entity. There's going to be the rich and the poor and the conservative and the moderate and so on and so forth. So we're always such a wide spectrum of experiences that it's unfair if you generalize and say, this is what the stereotype or the prototype archetype of the Afghan is feeling or going through. And also look, every household in Afghan, and this reminds me of a story of Buddha, because Kisa Gutme, who was one of Buddha's followers, she brought her baby that had died to Buddha and begged him to bring the baby to life. And Buddha told her that he would do that if Kisa Gutme could bring him a grain of rice from a house that had not seen sorrow. So Kisa Gutme went away and she comes back a few days later and she asks Buddha to bury the child for her. Because there is no household that hasn't seen sorrow. And in Afghanistan, there is no household that hasn't seen members die, that hasn't seen bombings, that hasn't seen injuries. So, I mean, psychologically, we're all carrying traumas of our own, of our ancestors that were given to us in our heirlooms. So I guess that way as well, there is no normal Afghan.
ما قصدته بالتحديد هو كيف تعيش الغالبية من السكان. عموما دعنا نتجاوز هذه النقطة لنتحدث عن الاقتصاد. كيف تدير طالبان الاقتصاد؟ هل من المبكر الحديث عن فشل في إدارة هذا الملف؟
I mean, look, there have been failures in quite a few sectors, but I think we can't really blame them for the economy crashing because Afghanistan was already in a very dangerous zone with regards to a possible humanitarian crisis. That means we were already so aid dependent. And then when the Taliban came, the aid went away. And then Also, our foreign assets were frozen. There was a liquidity issue where the banks knew that everyone was trying to pull their money out, so they stopped giving funds out. The banking sector is basically dysfunctional still. We have sanctions on Afghanistan. Our sanctions are worse than the sanctions that Russia had to face for invading Ukraine. Now imagine the Taliban coming to power out of no one's consensus or no one's support but their own, and yet 35 million people have to pay the price for it. So considering all of that, the fact that the Taliban still are generating revenue, they have disclosed economic figures that look promising, that are doing better than the years of the Republic. So those are promising signs. But the problem is that the economy is so closely tied up with the politics and the international diplomacy that if the Taliban don't manage to fix those things, our local economy probably doesn't have a lot of chance of thriving or finding stability.
هل من أمل بعودة الفتيات إلى المدارس بداية العام الدراسي الجديد؟
The issue so far has been when you look at the Taliban and you ask them why girls' schools have been closed, they will give you a half a dozen excuses, which has gone from religious reasons, cultural reasons, political reasons, logistical reasons, and so on and so forth. And everyone has their assessment, but I think one of the major issues right now is that there are certain people within the Taliban that are very powerful, and they believe that the place for women is inside the house, that they don't belong in the public sphere. And that's problematic. That's problematic because even if the schools are opened for girls, and yes, private schools for high schools for girls are open. Yes, public high schools in certain provinces are open. But as long as there's a policy that says that public schools will not be open for high school going girls, it's a problem. It's a problem because it's a de facto ban on university education as well, because if no one's graduating school, no one's going to university. And also at the core of it is the problem of how you see women. And if your conviction is that women don't deserve equal rights, that they don't deserve opportunities, that they shouldn't exist in the public sphere, that's problematic. That means that in the longer run, one way or the other, you will constantly keep invading the private spheres of women's lives. We already have male guardian rules that they've put out. We already have dress codes that they've put out. And all of those are symptoms of the core of the problem, which is the way that they view women and their understanding or interpretation of how Islam or their culture views women.
إلى أي مدى يمكن للأفغان التحاور مع حركة طالبان في المواضيع التي تخص حياتهم اليومية مثل موضوع دراسة الفتيات؟ هل من آلية للتواصل؟
Well, the Taliban, for lack of credit to them, haven't established such mechanisms. But that being said, I and quite a few of my activist and academic friends, we decided very early on when the Taliban came to power that we were going to take up physical and intellectual spaces, which meant that we forced the Taliban to acknowledge us as stakeholders within Afghanistan. And there have been quite a few instances where we've sat across the Taliban in dialogue sessions and we've communicated our concerns to them. Obviously, ultimately, it's up to them whether they change, whether they listen, whether they want to make this sustainable. But we are creating more and more opportunities for us to interact and to build some sort of relationship. But again, they have to decide whether they want it to happen or whether they want to create a future that accommodates all of us.
تحدثت عن التحاور مع طالبان حول نقاط الخلاف، لكن هل هو مسموح توجيه انتقاد لحركة مسلحة؟
Look, I think there's ways of doing things and then there's ways of doing things. I know that if I go out on the street right now and start chanting slogans against the Taliban, that I will be taken away and I will be punished for it. I know that if I go on local media and there's a certain tone that I cross, then I'm in trouble. So I have to constantly make a decision of how important my voice is and whether I can make sure to water down my tone to an extent where the message gets delivered, but I don't get in trouble or I don't get anyone else in trouble. So you have to maneuver very tricky waters. And obviously it's not easy. Friends of mine have been taken away, tortured, killed, and sadly that is going to continue. But that shouldn't mean that we should stop, because people have used nonviolent action against much more brutal regimes and outsiders and colonizers. These are just Afghans who are a product of violent times and violent contexts. So all we need to do is initially take away, peel off this othering where they see us as the other, where we see them as the other. Beyond that, once we've humanized each other, I think communication, interaction, engagement, and us taking up our space is eventually going to lead to some sort of constructive conversation that can become a national discourse and become hopefully better policies. You have so many examples of countries that did have regimes that had a very narrow vision for people's lives and for governance, and they've evolved with time, right? Within our region, Muslim countries. So we can always look at them as models and eventually hope that we grow out of where we are right now.
بعد أن تولت حركة طالبان السلطة سعت إلى تهدئة المخاوف الدولية بشأن حقوق المرأة الأفغانية، لكنها تراجعت فيما بعد. لماذا برأيك؟
I think one of our issues generally in the Muslim world is that we don't learn from our mistakes, which means that the first time the Taliban were in power in the 90s, we had the same assumption. We thought that the Taliban were sophisticated, that they were worth engaging with, and so on and so forth. And then the Taliban came to power and they were very different than what we imagined. This time as well, especially the fact that the Taliban fought such a long war of attrition with the US, that it engaged in such sophisticated psychological operations in which they had really intensive and effective PR campaigns and strategies, and their military campaign was executed to perfection. We thought that maybe the Taliban were very rational, were very smart, but since they've come to power, they've proved otherwise. And I think the problem was with our expectation. I don't think it is helpful to see the Taliban as 2.0 or 1.0. Al-Haqiqa, that the Taliban are just another political group that are new to power, that are trying to learn how to move ahead. But the hope this time, one thing that gives me hope, is that this time the Taliban have a large majority within them that do not think that things should be run the way that the small minority, powerful old guard are running things, which is a good opening. That means that the international community and us, the Afghan activists, we can invest in that large majority and hope that the Taliban within them can find a mechanism where these people eventually come to power and that old guard thinking eventually goes away. So it's not easy, it's not ideal, but we don't get to choose the cards that we are dealt. We only decide how to play them, right?
في الإعلام يتم تداول الكثير من الأنباء التي من الصعب التأكد من صحتها، مثل أن هناك قيوداً عامة فرضتها الحركة على الرجال أمرتهم بارتداء زي خاص وإطلاق اللحى. هل هذا ما يحدث في أفغانستان؟ وما مصير المخالفين؟
Look, I'll give you a specific answer to that question and then a general answer with regards to the misinformation and propaganda as well. So, I have a friend who went to the ministry, and here's the problem. The problem is that the Taliban give rulings, and then those rulings are applied very randomly, very sporadically at different places, meaning they tell you that women should cover their face. And then there are a lot of places within the city where no one is going to bother you, but then there'll be one random Taliban enforcer that will bother you and punish you for it. Same goes for the dress code for men. There are a lot of ministries where you can go and work and no one's going to say anything to you. But a friend of mine who works at a ministry, he showed up. One of the Taliban grabbed him by the collar, told him that he needed to wear his hat. He wore his hat forcefully. He went inside his office, he took off his hat, and the Taliban fighter barged in, loaded his gun, and he said, I'm going to kill you because you don't respect our rules, and so on and so forth. So there's that problem that, yes, some people have had those experiences. With regards to misinformation as well, you have to realize that the world has become this post-truth world where people can just say fake things. They can say things that are untrue and call them alternative facts, right? And journalism has turned into this tool as well. And one of the problems is that the Taliban have cracked down on free media, which means that you barely get any reports, which creates a lot of vacuum and open space for those who want to see Afghanistan fail, for those who are enemies of the Taliban, to put out so much misinformation out there that, just like you said, people find it difficult to know what is true and what is false. And this is a failure of the Taliban. And this makes our life so much more difficult because everything that you read, you have to verify on your own. A lot of people are too lazy to verify information, so they just believe whatever they see and read. And yeah, everyone who has an agenda has an outlet to create the truth that they want.
وكأنك تخبرني أن طالبان لا تسيطر على عناصرها، وأن تطبيق القوانين آليته الهوى وليس الضوابط والقوانين الواضحة.
Yeah, we've always criticized this. Look, there's something called vagueness doctrine, okay? Which means that your qawaneen should not be unclear, right? They should not be ambiguous. Meaning, if I tell you, hey, you're not supposed to wear jewelry to work, right? That should mean is not enough. Like, I have to literally tell you what I mean by jewelry, what the punishment will be if you ever wear jewelry, and so on and so forth, and what the mechanism of enforcing is. So when the Taliban just says, I want women to wear hijab, right? It leaves so many questions open, and you give so much power to your enforcers, who at the end of the day are graduates of religious school, who haven't lived in the cities, who haven't interacted with people, who've come out of years and years of fighting. That means that they're not ready for civic engagement with the civilians, which is why we see so many problems with the Taliban aren't as organized as a normal government would be, because this was an insurgent group that was fighting like a guerrilla outfit. It was very fluid. So there was not a lot of command and structure. So they're not very used to obeying orders and being very disciplined. But also the idea that they're giving them such confusing orders. And sometimes they feel like they don't have to enforce them. Sometimes they feel like they have to enforce them, back and forth, which just creates so much confusion, and so many people end up suffering because of it.
هل نسي العالم الأفغان؟ هل تخلى الغرب عنكم؟
No, I think that's an unfair assessment. I mean, who is the US to me to abandon me or for me to have expectations from them? But again, the US owes it to Afghanistan. Yeah, no, I'm just saying, like, the West owes Afghanistan, but the West isn't some entity that I have expectations from. The fact that they got involved in Afghanistan, invaded Afghanistan 20 years ago, stayed there for 20 years, means that Afghanistan is their legacy. Afghanistan is their problem. And as global citizens, Afghanistan is everyone's problem. If you're worried about terrorism, Afghanistan's your problem. If you're worried about human suffering, Afghanistan's your problem. That being said, I think Afghanistan has had its ups and downs with the attention of the world. Ukraine happened, so naturally a lot of the attention went away from Afghanistan, but we still have a window. And I think that if the Taliban persist with their policies, eventually that attention is going to die out. So we need to make sure that there is useful engagement so the world doesn't really forget about Afghanistan, and it supports Afghanistan, because Afghanistan really needs support at this time.
على الجبهة الدولية لم يتم الاعتراف بطالبان من قبل أي دولة حتى الآن. هل يمكن لطالبان الامتثال للشروط الغربية بتحسين سجلها في ملفي حقوق الإنسان والمرأة؟
It sounds like a very good idea. I wish that they thought like you as well. But the fact is that every group, whenever they're in dialogue or in discussion, they look at their own values, and then they decide, what are my sacred values? What are my muqaddasat? right? So, which make me who I am. And the Taliban very often look at how they view women or how people should dress or the importance of Amr bil Ma'ruf Nahy al Munkar as core to their identity. If they don't do it, they aren't Taliban, they aren't Muslim, they aren't an Islamic state, right? So that makes things tricky. But I guess there are still ways to work around that. And that happens when Afghans internally start having a dialogue and then the international community has communication with the Taliban, where at that level of trust, they agree on a middle ground or a ground that is tolerable, at least to Afghans, right? I mean, look, the Taliban didn't fight 20 years to march into Kabul with their tanks and guns only to listen to you and me tell them what is right and what is wrong, right? But that being said, they need to be told that even if they want to build the world in the way that they want to, there are certain lowest standards that they have to meet, right? Which means that they cannot do things like ban girls from education or this and that. And that needs to be communicated to them, and that needs to be reinforced in international dialogue, in internal dialogue, and so on and so forth. So it's not an easy task. Like, it's going to take time. It's a huge change. It's a very new group to government. So I mean, Afghans are still trying. We're still here. We're still fighting. We're still trying to make something out of it.
سؤالي الأخير، هل يمكن أن تتقبل طالبان الشراكة في الحكم من قبل تكنوقراط من المختصين من أمثالك؟
Yes, I think one of the major issues so far has been that the Taliban have only been considering their own fighters as worthy of higher positions. They've been distributing political positions like it was Ghanima from the war. So all of those are problematic issues, and we keep telling them, even if you don't want to include other political parties, at least include activists or academics or technocrats, generally people who know how to do a job, right? Personally, I wouldn't join the Taliban government. I think the Taliban government still has to show quite a bit. They have to earn the legitimacy and trust of the Afghan nation for me to attach all my aspirations and all my future to them. So there's quite a bit that they have to do, but there are people within the Taliban, friends of mine, who you had high positions within the Republic and they're still serving Afghanistan, and hats off to them. I am still trying to serve my nation by doing the aid work that I do, by lecturing the way I do. And I hope things get better, and hope is the only thing that we have, and we're not going to let go of it.
شكرا جزيلا لك عبيد الله بهير للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure being on your show.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.